Reconnect பண்றாராம். Message அனுப்ப சொன்னாரு.
We'll help you. Don't worry.
Fine, sir. Sir, it is the 23rd slide.
23rd. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir. The Renaissance. Renaissance writers added the doctrine of the unities of time and place to Aristotle's original demand for the unity of action. Next slide. The next critic in line was Giambattista Giraldi. Giraldi, he was the Italian dramatist, poet, and literary critic. He was embroiled in a number of controversies. Like Dante, he spoke in favor of the use of vernacular languages. And as against influential classical notions of literature, deriving from Aristotle and Horace, he advocated a new genre, the romance, a lengthy romance, a poem which combined elements of the classical epic with those of medieval romances. Next slide, sir. Giraldi tends to view literature in a historical context, which means that classical values are not necessarily applicable to all ages. He also reacted both in his dramas and in his theory against many of Aristotle's prescriptions for tragedy, especially unity of action and unity of time. Next slide. His literary criticism, of which his Discorso intorno al compartile, it is written in English as Discourse on the Composition of Romances, was the most controversial and influential, anticipates and parallels some of the views of Mazzoni, Du Bellay, and Coleridge. Next slide, sir. In his discourse, Giraldi states unapologetically that romances directly contravene. They contravene Aristotle's precept that an epic should imitate a single action. Romances deal not only with many actions, but with many characters, building the whole fabric of their work upon 8 or 10 persons. Next slide, sir. Giraldi also promotes an ideal of organic unity. He suggests that a poem must fit together as do the parts of the body. Next slide, sir. Giraldi's modernism is constrained in its call to innovation. He recommends that Italian poets follow the example laid down by the better poets in this language who have already written excellent romances. Next slide. Giraldi attempts a balance or compromise between classical virtues and contemporary artistic needs. The next critic is Lodovico Castelvetro. Castelvetro is best known for his stringent reformulation of Aristotle's unities of time and place in drama. His rigid approach being subsequently endorsed by neoclassical writers. Next slide, sir. Unlike most of his predecessors and contemporaries who had written commentaries on Aristotle's poetics, we find Castelvetro saw Aristotle's text as merely the unfinished draft of an uncompleted work. Next slide, sir. In various parts of his text, Castelvetro does concede that poetry may have a salutary effect on its audience, but such an effect is not essential of nature of poetry. Castelvetro, next slide, sir. Castelvetro denies the title of poet to those who have written history or science or art in verse form. He says the true poet is essentially an inventor, a creator. In fact, next slide, Castelvetro qualifies this by urging that the poet's portrayal of events must be marvelous, since the marvelous is especially capable of giving pleasure. Next slide, sir. Castelvetro's views of tragedy usually agree with Aristotle's, though often for different reasons. Like Aristotle, he considers plot the most important element on the grounds that it requires more labor than the other elements. Next slide, sir. The unities of time and place were first formulated by Castelvetro, and it was his authority that underlay their popular dissemination. His formulation of these unities, mistakenly thought to be based on Aristotle, endowed the doctrine with high authority for over 200 years. Next slide, sir. The purpose of poetry is to increase knowledge of good and bad in human character, but to offer the common people the greatest possible pleasure in their representations of actions never before seen. In short, in general, he agrees with Aristotle's doctrine of the unities, and in fact, he extends their application but offers a different rationale for them. He accepts Aristotle's definition of the unity of a plot as consisting of a single action of a single person, or at most two actions which are closely interrelated. Next slide, sir. Moreover, he argues that Aristotle's criterion of unity is too narrow. He says actions can also be related by pertaining to one person or one place or one nation. Next slide, sir. Castelvetro reformulates Aristotle's notion of the unities into a prescription for detailed realism. And he's followed by the next critic, Jacopo Mazzoni. Was born in Cesena, Italy, was a scholar. His major work was the treatise called, in English, On the Three Ways of Man's Life, the active, the contemplative, and the religious. Mazzoni, in defending Dante's poem, formulated a comprehensive and systematic aesthetics of poetic imitation. Next slide, sir. Next second slide, sir. One more. Yeah. Mazzoni opposes the view that metaphysics is a comprehensive science of which all other parts and sciences are a part. Next slide, sir. There are three types of objects, says Mazzoni. The three ways in which they can be approached. They are idea, work, idol. Acknowledging that poetry is an imitative art, Mazzoni seeks to define it according to its medium, its subject matter, its efficient cause, and its final cause. Mazzoni urges that the poet must always use particular and concrete means that will appeal to the senses. He can, by all means, talk of things which are speculative and abstract. Philostratus did not consider sophistic art as low and scandalous, but as a worthy and noble pursuit, which in some ways participated in the rectitude of true philosophy. Mazzoni, in fact, concludes that poetry is a rational faculty and must be classified with those rational faculties which are concerned not with truth, but with the apparent credible. Next slide, sir. Mazzoni now takes up the question of the final cause or purpose of poetry. Poetry can be viewed in three different modes as having three different ends or purposes. Imitation, to produce delight, and the third one, amusement directed, ruled, and defined by the civic faculty. Poetry, heroic poetry, is aimed at the soldiers, spurring them to imitate the glorious deeds narrated in such verse. Next slide, sir. Tragedy, which depicts the dreadful and terrible downfall of great persons, is aimed at the ruling classes. And the comedy is aimed at the lower classes only to console them for their modest fortune. The next critic in line is Torquato Tasso. Tasso has long enjoyed a reputation as both one of the finest poets of the Renaissance and an influential critic. His own revised discourses on the heroic poem had a considerable impact, not only in Renaissance, but also on subsequent literary theory in Italy, England, and France, all the European countries. Next slide, sir. Aristotle is one of the main sources of Tasso's text, the others being Horace and the canons of classical rhetoric. Tasso takes up the Stoic view that poetry imitates human and divine actions. He rejects the idea any divine action can be imitated as such and concludes poetry is an imitation of human actions, fashioned to teach us how to live. And since every action is performed with some reflection and choice, poetry will deal with moral habit and with thought. Tasso straightaway rejects the idea derived from the Horace Ars Poeticas. Yes, sir. Sir, I think previous one, we just, yeah. For Horace, a single art cannot have two purposes which are somehow unrelated. Hence, either poetry should set aside any useful purpose, such as instructing in content itself wholly with delighting, or if it wishes to be useful, it should direct its pleasure to this end. It may be that pleasure directed to usefulness is the end of poetry. That was Tasso's reason for rejection. Next slide, sir. Tasso follows Aristotle in stating that narration is the mode proper to the epic or heroic poem. In fact, the effect of tragedy, he says, is to purge the soul by terror and compassion. That of comedy is to move laughter at base things. Similarly, the epic poem ought to afford its own delight with its own effect, which is perhaps to move wonder. He calls the epic poem the most beautiful of all kinds and the most magnificent. As such, it provides its own distinctive delight, a delight produced through metaphor and the other figures of speech. Next one, sir. In arguing the superiority of epic, Tasso is, of course, challenging the authority of Aristotle. Aristotle, who urged the superiority of tragedy, given that it has all of the elements of epic, but in greater concentration and unity. But Tasso denies that tragedy achieves its end better. He is of opinion that tragedy achieves this by an oblique and tortuous road, while epic takes a direct way. Next team of defenders, they defend vernacular. They are Du Bellay, Ronsard, and Sidney. Next slide, sir. Notwithstanding the humanist reverence for the classics, many of the most illustrious minds of the Renaissance, including such writers as Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, William Langland, and so on, they wrote in the vernacular. Some of these, such as Petrarch and Dante, felt called upon to theorize and defend their practice. Next slide, sir. In case of Italy, it lacked a national language. Dante had been obliged to defend the universal dialect that had been used by major Italian poet. Fine. His arguments were subsequently reinforced by later writers such as Trissino, Battista, Alberti, Pietro Bembo, who claimed that the Balsari Castrigo advocated the language of the court. Excuse me, sir.
You can have a glass of water, sir. No problem.
Yeah, yes. So we find arguments in favor of the vernacular assume a strongly nationalistic and patriotic posture, the work of the French writer Du Bellay and the English writer Roger Ascham. Du Bellay, Joachim Du Bellay. Like Dante, who undertook to defend the virtues of his Italian vernacular language as against Latin, Du Bellay engaged in a sustained defense of his French vernacular. Next slide, sir. Du Bellay's defense and illustration of the French language, it was written in a response to a pamphlet, The Equality of French Popular Poetry with Latin Verse. Next slide. His basic purpose in this treatise is to show that the French vernacular is not incapable of good letters and erudition. Next slide, sir. In response to the charge that the French language is barbarous, Du Bellay enlists two arguments, both of which highlight the nationalistic nature of his enterprise. He points out that the term barbarous is applied to a people's language and culture by its enemies, by those who had no right to give them his name. The Greeks and Romans were more diligent in the cultivation of their languages. Next slide, sir. The French language may rise to such height and greatness that it can equal the Greeks themselves and the Romans. His text clearly connects cultural greatness with political and economic power. Next slide, sir. Du Bellay calls upon French writers to imitate the good Greek and Roman authors, urging upon them to Horatian precepts of the need to labor over art, the need, labor over art, to exercise great discretion in the choice of which writers to imitate and to know their own capabilities. Next slide, sir. The next critic in line is Pierre de Ronsard. He was engaged in intense study of Greek and Latin poetry, was dedicated to a renewal of French poetry and language based on imitation and adaptation of classical models. Ronsard's A Brief on the Art of French Poetry was published in, so is it going well, sir? Hello? Mr. Mothe, is it going well? Fine, doctor. So Ronsard's A Brief on the Art of French Poetry was published in 1565. His
slide number, sir. Kindly slide number.
Sir, 76.
Okay.
Like Horace Ars Poetica, this brief takes the form of a letter offering advice to a young poet, in this case of young nobleman, Alphonse Delbin.
Where is it, sir?
Is it fine, sir?
Uh, is it okay? The slide one. This
Yes,
slide.
sir. Perfect. Perfect.
Okay.
So you may, sir, it is 75 now. 75, sir.
Here it is showing, sir.
Okay, fine, sir.
Which one?
No, what you showed is fine, sir. What you showed is fine. Yeah, you can come back. Next.
This one?
Next, sir. Please move to next, sir. Next. Yes, sir. Yes, fine. We'll go by
This
that.
one, sir.
Yes, it's fine, sir. We'll go from that. Sir Philip Sidney, he's the line of in this group, the group which was strongly supporting vernacular. Sir Philip Sidney, as you know, he was born in Kent in 1554 and died in Netherlands. He was a courtier, soldier, poet, diplomat, multiple talent person. His talents encompassed not only poet and cultivated learning, but the virtues of statesmanship and military service. In fact, he was a well-rounded Renaissance man. Next slide, sir. Poetics and the defense of poetry. We find the defense of poetry had been undertaken aggressively by Boccaccio in his genealogy of the Gentile gods. Following him, his own endeavor, notable manifestos of defenses of poetry were undertaken by writers such as Du Bellay and Sir Philip Sidney. The Apology for Poetry. It is in many ways a seminal text of literary criticism. It represents the first synthesis in the English language of Renaissance literary criticism. It raises issues such as the value of function of poetry, the nature of imitation, and the concept of nature. It was written as a defense of poetry against Puritan attack on poetry, entitled The School of Abuse by Stephen Gosson. Apology for Poetry, it goes with points of 6 to 7, 6 points. Chronology or antiquity of poetry, the authority of ancient tradition, which means the argument from tradition. Both Greeks and the Romans honored poets. The Romans called the poets, in fact, Vades, which means a foreseer, a prophet. The relation of poetry to nature. In Greek, the word poet means maker or a creator. The poet, he suggests the divine nature of poetry as a godlike activity. In connection to the function of poetry as imitation, we find Sidney defines poetry as an art of imitation. It is representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. And its end is to teach and delight. The object of both teaching and delighting is goodness. The status of poetry among the various disciplines and learning. In fact, we find poetry superior to all other branches of learning. That is what we have been observing. In this respect, poetry is superior both to history and philosophy as well. Philosophy presents merely abstract precepts, and history deals with concrete facts or examples of virtue. But here we find poetry is superior than many, and almost all the branches. The relationship of poetry to truth and morality. We find Sidney strongly believes all these 6 points, truths, opinions in this poet. We find Sidney addresses the charges laid by Stephen Gosson in the School of Abuse. There are 4 charges. The poetry is a waste of time. He blames poetry as mother of lies, is nurse of abuse. Tasso had rightly banished the poets from his idle world. These are all the charges against poetry, for which Sidney Next poem, sir. Sidney dismisses a first charge on the basis that there is no learning so good as poetry in reaching and moving to virtue. He rejects the second charge that poets are liars, saying that the poet affirms nothing and therefore never tells lies. Next slide, sir. To the third charge, Sidney replies that poetry does not abuse man's wit, it is man's wit that abuses poetry. Poetry is a double-edged sword, he said. The most serious charge that Sidney confronts is that Plato banished poets from his idealistic republic. We find for Sidney, Plato warned men not against poetry, but against its abuse. And in fact, the contemporary poets who fill the world with wrong opinions about the gods, they have been banished, not the poets of support. We just move on to the third team of critics who were on the side of poetic form and rhetoric, Gascoigne and Putnam. During the Renaissance, rhetorical theory enjoyed a renewed centrality in educational institutions. They focused on strategies of invention and on style. This new emphasis was partly fueled by increasing displacement of Latin by vernacular languages, which were in their turn subjected to stylistic analysis. George Putnam's The Art of English Poesy was based on rhetorical analysis of style. Some writers also offered a rhetorical treatment of poetry. Next slide, sir. One more, sir. Next slide. The humanists rejected rhyme as an unclassical barbarism. The controversy over rhyme was salient in the debate between Samuel Daniel and Thomas Campion. Next slide, sir. So George Gascoigne, the poet and dramatist George Gascoigne, is credited with having written the first written literary critical essay in the English language entitled Certain Notes of Instruction Concerning the Making of Verse or Rhyme in English. It was published in 1575. His essay, Certain Notes, next slide, sir, follows in the tradition of Ars Poetica as a treatise or manual offering advice to the aspiring poet on the entire range of rhetorical issues, including invention, prosody, verse form, and style. Next slide, sir. The feature of poetic composition that Gascoigne most insists upon is fine invention or the finding of appropriate theme and material. Next slide. In other words, a poet should not be distracted by rhyme for its own sake, nor should he allow the search for rhyme to guide the matter of the poem. Next slide, sir. Gascoigne also advises the poet to be consistent in his use of meter throughout a poem. Much of the advice offered by Gascoigne moves in the direction of both standardizing certain English poetic and metrical practices and differentiating these from foreign practices. Next slide, sir. Sir, please move one more, sir. Putnam, George Putnam. We find a long and influential treatise entitled The Art of English Poesy was published anonymously in 1589, which was attributed to George Putnam. Though evidence of this is not conclusive and continues to be argued by scholars. Next slide, sir. The central purpose of his treatise is similar to that of writers such as Dante and Du Bellay. It was to justify the use of vernacular language for poetry and specifically to establish English vernacular poetry as an art, requiring serious study and labor. Next slide, sir. The art is divided, according to him, into 3 books. The first justifying poetry as expressing the needs of individual and society. The second book is about which devoted to the craft of poetry, and the third offering renaming of the figures and troops of classical rhetoric. Slower. In his treatise, Putnam defines the poet as both a maker and an imitator, in an ability that as in Sidney's defense, raises poetry above all other arts and sciences. Next slide, sir. Like Sidney, Putnam notes the disrepute into which poetry has fallen, barbarous ignorance. And the poet's externality to a busy life of vain, ridiculous actions of the people. Next slide, sir. Putnam defines style not as contained in the particular words or phrases, but as a constant and continual phrase. Next slide, sir. He reaffirms the classical principle of decorum, whereby a high style should express a lofty subject matter and a low style, a meaner subject. Next slide, sir. He sees the arts of grammar, rhetoric, and logic as simply a formalization acquired by studious observation and practice of his natural abilities. Next slide, sir. Putnam's text represents in many ways an important stage in the development of modern English criticism, long anticipating what will become romantic reactions against neoclassicism and even moving toward a notion of art as primarily offering pleasure. To sum up, let's see the features of Renaissance criticism. They fall into many points. Theory of imitation. As we know, the Renaissance critics' theory of imitation is different from that of Plato and Aristotle. Imitation for Plato and Aristotle was the imitation of persons and things in nature, whereas Horace and Longinus used it as meaning of imitation of other writers. And as we know, the Renaissance critics followed the letters they used by the Renaissance. Yes. The truth, value, and didactic role of literature. Right? They find the unities. The classical unities. We find the Renaissance writers added the doctrine of unity of place to Aristotle's original demand for the unity of time and action. The notion of verisimilitude, we find it must imitate objects that are real, not fantastic. Its manner of imitation must appear probable or at least possible to the audience. The use of vernacular was emphasized more. So many Renaissance writers wrote in the vernacular, and some of these writers theorized and defended their practice. They were obliged to address controversial issues of meter, rhyming, and versification in vernacular tongues. The definition of poetic genres, find especially such as narrative and drama, they wrote in the ancient forms genres of epic, tragedy, comedy to attain the ancient spirit. This, in a way, molded their style upon that of the great ancients. Find the invention of new mixed genres. The Renaissance critics did not accept the mixing of genres. For example, the tragic comedy, they are of opinion that it can destroy the sense of decorum. The use of rhyme in poetry, we find the Renaissance writers rejected the regular stress-based alliterative meter of medieval poets. They rejected rhyme as an unclassical barbarism. Yes. The last point, the relative values of quantitative and qualitative verse. Yes, the Renaissance writers introduced classical qualitative meters based on length of syllables rather than stress into vernacular languages. And with that, I hope I have poured some glimpses about Renaissance criticism, and hope the participants would like to have some questions to pose. Thank you. Sir, the last slide can be projected.
Yes, ma'am.
For references.
Dr. Sangeeta ma'am, kindly
Sir?
hand over the session.
Yes, sir. Let us come to the end, sir.
Okay.
Sir?
Thanks for joining the, yes.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sir, very informative, sir. Due to some technical issues, we have some dropouts in the middle.
Okay.
Though it's taken place, we have successfully completed today's program, sir. It's very informative, very interesting. And thanks one and all. Thank you so much for your good presentation, sir. Thanks. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot. In fact, it has been you have been very supportive and being patient as well during these technical issues.
No
Thank you.
problem. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mazzoni.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.